What really drives the way we connect, commit, or stay single today? Dr. Geoff MacDonald, a psychology professor from the University of Toronto, joins us today to unpack the data behind modern love. From attachment and intimacy to why some people avoid closeness altogether. We'll explore how online dating, cultural shifts, and even money shape what we want in love, and what might be holding us back from finding it. It's what the science says about how we connect or don't in today's world. This is Research Made Relatable.
I'm Ayrik Pojhan.
And I'm Dr. Lee.
And welcome back to the Enriched Mindset Podcast.
Today we're joined by Dr. Geoff MacDonald, a University of Toronto professor, researcher, and expert on working issues around the intersection of attachment avoidance and intimacy. From developing ideas around fears of being single to understanding relationship maintenance processes, Dr. MacDonald's research helps us understand the intersection of singlehood and sexuality.
Dr. MacDonald, thank you so much for coming today. We're so grateful to have you here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, so Geoff, we start our podcast with a few psychology dad jokes. Okay, so are you ready?
I don't know. We'll find out. Okay.
All right. Why did the astronaut refuse to come back to Earth to see his girlfriend?
I don't know.
He said he needed more space.
Ready for the next one? All right. What did the psych student say to his stats prof who called him average?
No
You're
idea.
so mean. Okay. I like that one.
You went to the University of Waterloo, right? Yeah. I think you were my grad student TA potentially.
Oh, yeah, I think we talked about
Yes.
yeah.
You're familiar with Dr. John Holmes?
Yeah, he was my advisor.
Oh, okay, yeah. He was like probably the best prof I had at Waterloo.
He was a
Just
great
so
teacher.
engaging. Yeah. And he was on my committee for my PhD thesis. So
okay.
yeah, so I guess we were probably at one point classmates in grad school, but I was like a few years behind you.
I graduated
Yeah.
in 2000. Did you start by then?
Yeah, I started in 1999.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, but the fifth years never know who the first years are.
That's true. That's true. Do you know what John's up to these days?
He's retired now.
Okay,
yeah, and
yeah.
he stayed active for a couple of years after retiring, and he's stopped going to conferences now. So I think he's like retired.
Okay.
Yeah, I think he's living out in Santa Barbara. Is where
Oh,
he is.
wow.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Our audience would be really curious to know how you got into psychology. What sparked your interest in psychology?
Yeah, so it was a little bit of happenstance, and I think this is kind of important for like students in particular to hear. Is I think that they think that us professors had some like grand master plan. We're like, we were moving the pieces Game of Thrones style to end up here the whole time. The big thing that happened to me is when I graduated undergrad, there was a recession on. I was just looking at these stats yesterday. People are complaining about youth unemployment. When I graduated, it was higher than it is now. So I needed something to do, and I went and I hid out in grad school for 5 years without really kind of a big plan. And I just kind of like trucked along in grad school. I had a really good time. I really enjoyed myself. I did my work to the best of my ability. But it kind of took me a while to figure out that this was actually the career path that I wanted. And the way it happened is I kept trying to think of like, what else would I want to do? And I never came up with an answer. And then eventually, like years later, I've got a friend who's a consultant for one of these like high-powered consulting firms. And she gave me one of these like aptitude tests for what I should do with my career. And it said that I should either be a minister, and the market for agnostic ministers is thin at best, or a psychologist or a professor. So it kind of seems like I hit the bullseye by accident.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, what about specifically singlehood and relationships? What sparked your interest there?
Yeah, I mean, again, the first half of that is a little bit of happenstance. That when I was in undergrad, the thing that really got me interested was conformity and nonconformity. So I did my undergraduate thesis on that. And when I went to University of Waterloo for grad school, the guy that I would have done conformity research with happened to be on sabbatical at the time, Mark Zana.
Oh, yeah.
And so John took me on and he did romantic relationship research.
Yep.
But it's not hard to find your own reasons to do romantic relationship research when you're like 22 years old and angsty,
Right.
So I found my own path with that. So that was a little bit of happenstance, but as I went through my career, I got into doing like attachment research, and there's all kinds of like self-discovery that you can do with that. So that part was a combination of like kind of luck and like it was cheaper than a therapist, right? But as I progressed in my career, and I had done attachment research for a long time, and I find a lot of academics, I think, have this experience where you do something for long enough and you kind of like, you figured it out, like you answered the question that you started out to answer. Yeah. And what I noticed is that there was starting to be more of this public discussion of singlehood. But what I felt like was that it was largely about, here are these happy single people, and let's completely foreground these happy single people. And like anybody else, I knew a lot of people who were ambivalent about singlehood, who didn't really enjoy singlehood. And I didn't really see those voices being represented in that conversation. And I felt like it was important because I think it's really important to forward the voices of people who are happy being single. But if you take seriously the idea that there's a lot of people who don't enjoy it, you can kind of accidentally give those people the message, not only are you like lonely or sad, but it's weird that you're lonely or sad, right? And so I just felt like it was really important to try to do singlehood work and public-facing singlehood work in a way that let's try to represent all voices. So yeah, that was the thing that got me interested in the singlehood part. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. What led you to take a position as a senior lecturer at the University of Queensland, and what eventually brought you to University of Toronto?
I mean, the answer to both questions is market forces. So I've been offered 2 jobs as an adult in my life, and one of them was in Australia and one of them was at University of Toronto. So yeah, I mean, coming out of my postdoc, it can be tough to get a job as an academic. And I got really lucky that the one job that I got offered was at the University of Queensland in Brisbane. There were people doing relationship research there, really high quality university, and a fantastic place to live. So I took the job, and it was great. It was a great adventure. I recommend living in Australia to anybody. But it did have its challenges. In Australia, there was a particular research culture there where, as much as we had a couple of relationships people at my university, it wasn't really what was going on in the country. And as much as Australia is great in a lot of ways, if you want to connect with people in the States or in Canada, it's a long commute, right? Yeah. And so you miss a lot of the good conferences, you miss a lot of the good opportunities for collaboration. And honestly, at the time that I was where I got this offer to come to University of Toronto, I happened to be going through a divorce in my own life. It kind of just seemed like it was the right time to be moving closer to Canada. I had been applying to jobs in Canada for like 6 years at that point. Yeah. It was the first one that I had gotten offered. It was a once in a lifetime opportunity, right? Yeah. And so just the stars sort of aligned at that point. And it's turned out to be a great situation. I am awesome. Very glad that I came back home. Yeah,
Toronto's your home,
Sarnia is my home. But small town Ontario, about 3 hours from here. Yeah. But yeah, to come back to Canada felt really good at that point. Yeah.
I mean, what is the job market like for a grad student, someone who's done their PhD to become a assistant professor? What's that like in social psychology, for example, across North America?
Yeah, I think right now, I mean, like so many economic sectors, like it's uncertain.
It's always changing,
right? And so I think that, like, in particular, what's going on in the States which is where a lot of our students who become professors end up. It's just not really clear what the funding environment is going to be, what kinds of new jobs are going to be out there. In Canada, things are a little bit stable, but things are kind of uncertain around the world. So, it's difficult. I mean, I think like a lot of industries, there's always a place for the best people, but it's more competitive than it used to be. I mean, mind you, one of the things that I reflect about a lot is I graduated with my PhD back in 2000, and there wasn't much in the way of industry jobs back then. Yeah. So I do feel like the academic job market is probably tougher than it was sort of back in my day. But I also think that there's a lot more alternatives, especially if you invest yourself in like the data science part of it. I've had students who've gone on, one, for example, has gone on to work for Shane Sans-Cartier, has gone on to work for the Social Development and Research Corporation, which is a nonprofit policy-based organization. And that was just not on our radar back in the day,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of students are really gravitate towards social psychology and think that professorship is kind of like the one career option. So it's good to hear that there's other options. Like if you think about your peers in grad school, do you know where they all ended up?
A lot of them ended up in academic jobs in Ontario. I know you had my old friend Leanne Sonhing on here.
Okay,
So yeah, we have stories to tell about each other from grad school. Yeah, we got lucky. There was a lot of hiring. You know, I kind of waited out the recession in grad school, and the strategy kind of worked. Things started to open up after I graduated, and a lot of us, you know, Ann Wilson, who's a Wilfrid Laurier, for example. We had Poppy Lockwood, who's at University of Toronto, and is our department chair. We had a lot of people who got Canadian academic jobs back then.
Right. Just shifting gears to research journals, what was your experience like as lead editor for the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships?
I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. So I had been an associate editor for, I think it was like 4 years before I took over the lead editorship. And it was just an enjoyable role. I remember when I first started being an associate editor, I mean, you have imposter syndrome at like every level of the process, right? And one of the things that becoming an editor was really helpful for me was calibrating my judgment. You know, the number of times I would like read a paper that I'm supposed to make a decision on, and it turns out that 2 or 3 of the other reviewers saw exactly the same thing I did, was really helpful for me, you know, kind of like building my confidence and my judgment that way. You know, it was great in that you get a sneak peek at all of the research that's coming out. You are kind of forced to read stuff that you might not read that in the journal otherwise, right? So you develop this kind of like broader sense of what the field is like. And you make a lot of relationships with people. Like there's nothing more fun than like sending that acceptance letter, especially to like the grad student author, and this is their first paper. And developing, you know, I think people think of those editorial roles as adversarial. And they're much more often collaborative and cooperative than I think people expect them to be. Having said that, I am sure that I have sent out rejection letters and, you know, seeded grudges with people that I don't even know about at this point. Because you know, people have feelings about this stuff, right? But I really enjoyed that role. I really enjoyed that role.
Is there kind of one thing that you're, like a tip you can give people submitting papers that can kind of really facilitate the process and maximize success?
It's kind of a long-term play, but like especially early in your career, take opportunities to be a reviewer as much as you can. Experience what it looks like on the other side of this, right? Because I think it's like a lot of because it is. I mean, writing a paper is communication, and I think that good communicators are able to take on the perspective of their audience, right? And then you start to understand, like, what are people expecting? And it can just be like simple things, for example, right? Like in a talk or in a paper, if you're doing it on, let's say, low self-esteem, it's really tempting to then, I'm going to shorten this to LSE, and I'm going to make that like what goes through the manuscript. And that's easy for you because you've been thinking about self-esteem for 10 years. And your reader has been thinking about self-esteem for 10 seconds. And they're like, what does this have to do with the London School of Economics? Like, I have no idea. So doing everything you can to get in the mindset of what it's like, not to be the person trying to make the argument, but being the person who receives the argument.
Yeah, definitely taking into account your audience is probably the most important part. Moving on, you recently received the 2024 IARR Mentoring Award. What does that mentorship mean to you, and how has it shaped your work in academia?
Yeah, I mean, I just really enjoy being a mentor. You know, like, I mean, I wish I could sit here and tell you, like, oh, I actually wanted to do really selfish work, and I overcame that impulse, and like, you know, did this I ate my vegetables, and like, you know, did the mentorship stuff anyways, right? But I know one of the best things about being an academic, especially if you're doing it right, is it can be a very self-expressive job. You know, you get to structure your environment as much as you can. And one of the things that I've realized in my career is that I'm a better second author than I am a first author. I like editing more than I like writing. I have a very critical streak in me, which is not very useful at some times, but when you're reading a student's manuscript is really, really useful. And I just enjoy seeing students develop over time. Like, it's just something I get intrinsic enjoyment out of. So it is kind of, I think, an authentic expression of just how I like to do the work in general. And because I think that I'm better in that second editor role, I am more productive trying to do my work that way than writing a bunch of like sole author kinds of pieces, right? So it sets up this kind of like win-win dynamic where, you know, when I'm prioritizing reading my students' manuscript, they win and I win. So it
Yeah.
isn't, in a sense, hard for me to do. Yeah.
Now, moving on to single people, you've said that happy single people are understudied. Do you have any just general data that you can share with our audience, and then maybe talk about how evolutionary psychology kind of fits with the idea of a happy single person? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so it's definitely true, and I think that because I come from a background of doing like romantic relationship research, right? And I think that like kind of the history of that discipline helps understand why single people got ignored. I mean, first of all, academics is just an expression of culture generally, right? Like we're not separate from all of that. We're affected by the same perspectives and biases and stuff. And so single people just have been kind of not paid a lot of attention to by society in general, but romantic relationship research in particular. I think it was back in the 70s, one of our founding scholars got this, what was called like the Golden Fleece Award from the United States Senate. And the idea is you're fleecing the public by doing research on marriage and romantic relationships, right? When students come into my classes now, it looks like romantic relationship research is this big established, it's just always been, and people have always taken it seriously. But it wasn't taken seriously initially. And so when you're trying to establish legitimacy as a field, one of the things that helps is to kind of have a foil, right? And so like, I've made the argument that like single people was kind of like, be careful, you'll end up like these people if you don't fund my research, right?
Yeah.
So that was sort of how romantic relationship researchers, I think, first took on singlehood, is like, this is who you don't want to be. And then there were some really important voices that came up, Bella DePaulo in particular, who kind of made it clear that there are other ways to think about singlehood. Now, I mean, I think that one of the things that we're trying to resolve is what is the relationship between well-being and singlehood, right? And I think that the place that I've come to in all of that is that, if people assume that people in relationships are happier than people who are single, the data suggests that at the correlational level, that is true. If you take the average person who is partnered and you compare them to the average person who is single, the average person who is partnered tends to be happier. Some of that, we do have some longitudinal data that suggests that that's because getting into a relationship makes people happier. There's a debate as to how long that effect lasts. I don't think we have good data on that part right now. But there's also selection effects, right? So like, for example, extroverted people are more likely to get into a relationship. And it kind of makes sense. Like extroverted people have larger social networks, and so they're going to have more options for people to date. They also like spending time with people more. So having someone who's always in their space is going to be more appealing to them than someone who's introverted. And then, of course, the other thing about extroverts is that they're just happier, whether they're single or they're in a relationship. And so there are these selection effects where some of it is because happier people tend to get into relationships more. So I think that is something that I've kind of settled on. But I think that the other piece that's important to remember is that, saying that people in relationships are on average happier than people who are single doesn't mean that single people are unhappy, right? And so when you look at like mean levels on reports of like life satisfaction, people who are single on average are still above the midpoint, right? And so I think what we're talking about here, first of all, is single people being happy, but on average not as happy as people who are partnered. The other thing that's really important to pay attention to there is there's all kinds of single people, right? There's all kinds of variability among single people. And so, Lisa Walsh has some really great research looking at, different sort of classes, let's call it, of single people. And absolutely, the top band, the happiest band of single people is just as happy as the top band, the happiest people who are in relationships, right? So we need to be thinking about single people like not as this monolithic group, right? So I think that's really important. What was the second part of your question?
Like in terms of like numbers or data on like how many happy single people are out there. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I don't really have data on that because the way that I do my research is often like, what variables correlate with what variables. So usually what I'm looking at is like single people, let's say, with more secure attachment tend to be happier single people. But I don't typically have data on like, here's the percentage of single people like who are securely attached. So, yeah.
I mean, you hear about people saying, I'd rather be single than in an unhappy relationship, or single people who have very close friendships and supports. So when you talk about that upper band, are those the happy single people who have other ways to get their relational cup filled?
Yeah, that's Definitely, we think that that's a big part of it. So, we know, for example, that singles who have better relationships with their friends tend to be happier singles. Singles who have happier relationships with their family, they tend to be happier singles, but family is a bit of a double-edged sword for single people because family is great for providing emotional support and providing practical support. But we also have some data that suggests that, like, if anyone is going to get on your case to get in a relationship or to get married, it's going to be your parents in particular, right? So those can be somewhat ambivalent connections. Single people who are happier with their sex life tend to be happier singles. They'll tell you that they're less interested in getting into a relationship, but if you follow sexually satisfied singles over time, they're actually more likely to end up in a relationship. I believe the kids call it catching feelings, I think is what happens. Yeah, so basically there's a variety of different aspects of single people where, this is the way that I tend to think about it, right? Like, think about all of the things that you get out of being in a romantic relationship. The more of those that you're getting as a single person, the less motivation that you're going to have to get into a romantic relationship, right? So yeah, if you've got good connection with friends, if you've got good connection with family, especially, one of the things that's more unique to romantic relationships is having sexual experiences. If you're building that in a single life, you've got that much less motivation to change your life,
Right.
Yeah.
So doing those things piecemeal can be almost an equivalent to being in the romantic relationship itself?
It's a great question, right? Like singlehood research is so early that a lot of what we have is correlational data, right? And so it becomes, if you're single and you get out there and make more friends, just as a normal human being, I would assume that would help people, right? But there's also sometimes these personality effects, like the extroversion thing.
Right.
Like, maybe these single people who have more friends, it's because they're more extroverted, and an introvert who pushed themselves to go and have more friends, maybe that would and maybe that wouldn't make them feel more comfortable. I certainly think that if a single person is thinking of, like, what are the guideposts for some of the ways that I can make my life happier as a single person, getting out and just meeting people and taking advantage of the freedom that you have to be a single person by expanding your social network. Because that is the thing that, like, the data suggests that people in romantic relationships tend to feel like they have more emotional support in their lives. But what single people have is a broader social network. They've kind of got more of like a buffet of social choices available to them. And that has a lot of advantages. People get new creative ideas by talking to those people that they don't talk to that much. You hear about a job opportunity because you've got like a weak tie. Maybe the barista just knows something that if you're always talking to your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you never find out about, right? So that's the kind of social advantage that singles can have, yeah.
Could you explain some findings about the relationship between income levels and the desire for romantic relationships?
Okay, so we're talking breaking news here because we have a paper that's like literally going to come out any day now. It's been accepted in the Journal of Marriage and Family.
Perfect.
And we've been really interested in this angle. So I have time, so I'll give you the backstory, which is that we were interested in doing this research on the connection between income and singlehood because people would often say to me, like, oh, well, I bet you people will want to get in romantic relationships just because rent is so expensive, right? It's a very Toronto question. And so I was like, that's actually a really good question. And so we collected some data to look at what is the relationship between income and singlehood, and we found that people who have higher income tend to want a partner more, and then if you track them over time, they're more likely to actually get into a relationship. And so, again, it's very early days with this. It's correlational research, but one of the ideas that we've been playing with is that, when people are thinking about committing to a long-term relationship, that's putting them on a path to marriage, that's putting them on a path to having kids for a lot of people. And if you don't know whether you're going to have a job next year, if you don't know if you can afford to buy a place to live that could actually have kids in it, why would you put yourself in that position to just like get into a relationship that's not going to be tenable? So we kind of think of it in like a little bit of a hierarchy of needs kind of way, that like once you get your basic safety and security established, then you kind of move into a mode where like, okay, that was good. Like getting my career set was good. But now I feel this kind of itch to get in a relationship. And then we think that that's why, because one of the things in those data that really interested us was we didn't find a correlation between having higher income and being more satisfied with your singlehood, and would have made a ton of sense to us that like if you're richer, there's all kinds of things that you can do as a single person. You can go traveling, that point that I made before about if you can substitute what you would get from a romantic relationship as a single person, and there's a lot of shared labor that goes on in relationships. Somebody who fixes your car or cleans the apartment or cooks dinner, you can buy those things with more income. But what we think is that probably, and we need to test this. I'm rampantly speculating at this point, but we think that what might be happening is that you can buy those things and you can make your life easier and maybe even more exciting as a single person. But if we're right about that stage theory of life, it's it's nice that I can order in, skip the dishes tonight, but actually I feel kind of lonely, and that takes the edge off of it.
Right.
Yeah,
because you hear people delaying, for example, having children because of their financial situation, delaying getting married. Although I've recently been hearing there's a trend toward people getting married earlier now.
Oh, interesting.
So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on trends with Gen Z or Gen Alpha. Do you have any speculations or things that you predict might be happening with the economy?
Yeah, I think it really depends on where the economy goes, right? I think that in some quarters people are really worried about stuff like the birth rates, right? And I think that there's a tendency to be like, oh, what is wrong with it? This is evergreen, right? What's wrong with the new generation? Why are they making these dumb choices, and why do they not want love, right? And I tend to try to assume that when there are big phenomena happening, at the root of it is people making rational calculations about the environment that they see around them. So I think that what's happening with younger generations is they are accurately economically anxious, and so they are kind of tapping the brakes on a lot of this stuff. Now, I have not seen those data on people getting married earlier. That would be really interesting, and I would have to think that through. But I think we're kind of in a phase of everyone's just sort of waiting to see what happens, and I think that includes, because I think that what our research is doing on the income and singlehood front is that there are great studies on making the decision to get married, making the decision to have kids. It's actually another good example of the way that singlehood has been kind of invisible. It's people are doing this research on income and marriage, and it's how people get into the state to get married in the first place, right? They exit singlehood. Maybe we should follow this all the way back. And so that's what our research is suggesting, that this affects right at the root when people are making decisions about whether to even start a relationship in the first place. So I think that the kids are acting rationally, and I think it's up to us, if people are really serious about worrying about the birth rate and stuff, then we need to create the conditions where people can have predictable, good material conditions, and I think that's what has a chance of bringing back people's desire for connection.
Do you think economics aside that society has a higher expectation for either it's the male or the female or whatever? Do you think they have a higher expectation for how much they can provide or how much they're not providing, and so on top of economically everything's expensive, but there's also a higher expectation, or do you think it's kind of been the same?
I wonder about that. I mean, we are exiting my expertise at this point, but it's interesting to me because I live out in Scarborough, right? And so if you drive around Scarborough, you see all these post-war, they call them the strawberry box houses, right? And it's one floor bungalows, and people used to raise families in these things, right? And now you see them getting knocked down all the time, being replaced by these 3-floor box monstrosities. And so I think that there's potentially something to that, what is the minimum that you need to actually provide for a family and to actually provide for kids? So I think that that's possible. But again, I also think that there's an element of higher expectations for relationships. It's a very rational reaction to what has been happening to people. So, when we think about, for example, why is it that singlehood seems to be increasing in terms of how frequently or how many people are single, right? So one of the things that's happened over the last 50, 100 years is women have gotten in the workforce. And one of the big, one of the big incentives for people to get into heterosexual relationships had been that men tended to have money and women didn't. You now put it in a situation where women have more money than they used to and don't necessarily need to get into a relationship in order to just survive and have a roof over their heads. And of course their expectations for men are going to go up. What you need to deliver to make it worth a woman's time to get in a relationship has very much changed over the last like 50 or 100 years. And again, I think that, what people are doing in terms of like wanting more help from men around the house, I think is a very rational reaction to being in a different position than women were like 50 or 100 years ago.
Yeah, the roles are changing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it makes sense.
Were you ever familiar with this trend? I'm looking for a man in finance. Do you hear that trend?
I am.
Just like bouncing off that, you hear a lot of podcasts talk about the crisis among young men who can't get into a relationship, feel like they're a bit marginalized, and then women's expectations of men are so extreme that basically less than 1% of people fit into this category. So you have a really select group of men that really have it really well, and a significant proportion that are really struggling. Are you seeing that in the research you're doing at all?
I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm seeing that directly. I mean, I'm certainly familiar with the narratives, and it's just not my expertise. I'm not a sociologist, and so, it's hard for me to say exactly how the narratives line up with the reality. And I think that the frame that I find really useful for this, there's a great paper by Akiko Yoshida, and she was talking about singlehood in the Japanese context in particular, but I think that the general framework is useful, which is, I guess basically the idea that like society's norms change more slowly than the actual material conditions that society find themselves in, right? And so, as an example, we have the situation where women on average earn more money than they used to, but the norms around dating are sometimes still tied to when that wasn't the case, right? And so, for example, it is still the case that on average women want a male partner if they're into dating men that makes as much or more money than them, right? And that norm, it doesn't have to change. People can do whatever they want, but that's probably part of the reason why, for example, women find it harder to find people to date, and maybe men kind of are feeling the effects of that, is that literally, if your income goes up relative to men and your standard is somebody who makes more money than me, there are literally fewer people to choose from than there used to, right? And, assuming that not being in romantic relationships makes enough people lonely, what will happen is that norm will change. It will have to. It will become more normal for women to be the high income earner, but that hasn't happened yet. So I think that this is men's narratives they're not talking about nothing. Right? Like people are not stupid, and they notice when things change in their environment, and we're all just kind of making sense of that right now.
How do media narratives and societal expectations affect how people experience being single?
Yeah, it's my sense of that, and again, this is like not directly related to my research, but I think that the most convincing narrative that I've heard about the effect that media has on people is I don't think that media, again, we're a little bit outside my expertise here. I don't think the main thing it does is it makes people want different things than they actually want, but it is good at providing people scripts as to how life is supposed to work, right? So, what is a man supposed to do in order to be someone who's attractive in a relationship? I think that's a script that has been changing over the last 10, 15 years kind of thing, and I think that's reinforced by media narratives. So that's my sense of it, is it doesn't hugely change what people want, but it changes people's narrative about how to get to those places. Yeah.
So we have happy single people, but on an individual level, if you ask them if a relationship is going to help complete the picture, are people still wanting that even though they're objectively happy?
Yeah, I mean, what our data suggests is that the average single person, and we do this, statistically, we've got a scale and it says, how much do you desire a partner? And it's a scale, I think it's a scale from 1 to 7, where 4 is right in the middle, right? And across multiple studies, what you get is the average single person on the side of the scale that says, yes, I do want a relationship, but around a 5 out of 7 kind of thing, right? And so I do think that people still want it. I think it's that's not what I think has changed. I think that people love, we could go back to the evolutionary stuff, right? That I think there are good reasons why people crave romance in their life. It feels good, it's fun, it has a lot of benefits. I think it's the comparison that's changed, right? What is the alternative? Being single, I think, for a lot of people isn't as bad as it used to be,
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then jumping on that, what do you feel is the difference between being alone and lonely?
Yeah, I think it has to do with how much you enjoy or don't enjoy the state of being by yourself, you know? And so that's been one of the most interesting aspects of when people have started to focus their research on singlehood is one of the things that researchers started to focus on is what are the benefits of being alone. So I've got a colleague, Twivi Nguyen, and she's done a lot of research on solitude. And so her research and her data and her theory suggests that, you know, solitude is really useful for basically decompressing, right? That, like, for example, when people get stressed out, they will purposely choose solitude, not because they want to avoid talking to people, but they want to approach just being able to calm down a little bit, you know? So I think we've started to think more about what are the situations in which people enjoy being alone. And so if you're alone and you're not upset about that, you are emotionally regulating fine. I think that's a good, healthy version of being alone.
Right.
And lonely is craving someone to be there that's not there. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've known people who just, I guess, from an observational point of view, just seem like they can't be alone. They need to be in a relationship, but that they're not seeking relationships that are attuned to their values. They just need to be with somebody.
And that's, I mean, I think that's a hugely important distinction, right? Is that I think that if you're in a place of like wanting connection, that's just a normal human thing. If you like need it desperately like that, like kind of like an addict, that's when we're getting into your just inability to be with yourself, which is a very healthy place to be, you know? Yeah.
How do you think that like modern dating platforms have changed the landscape of intimacy and partner selection?
Okay, so I'm very bullish on online dating apps. So I'm just gonna go full contrarian here because I know that there's this narrative right now of like, oh, dating apps are the worst and they like commodify dating, and I get it. People have all kinds of bad experiences on online dating apps. You know, women in particular get a lot of pictures of body parts that they don't want. It can be, you know, the expression that I love is, I've heard this, that in the heterosexual context, that for men, online dating is a desert, and for women, it's a swamp. That it's like, that it's like, right? And so there's a very negative attitude, and there's a very negative sort of discourse happening around it. But here's the contrarian part, which is, first of all, as a researcher, whenever I see research or even media articles on how bad online dating is, they only interview people who are still single. They never interview people who found their partner via online dating. And, you know, I've seen statistics that something like 30 to 40% of marriages start from people online dating. And so, that's like, right? Like, if online dating is supposed to ruin relationships, it's doing a very bad job of it. So, I don't know. I mean, my thoughts around this is that, again, I mean, I think the data suggests that there's a decent number of people who are using online dating as a productive tool. And I guess that's how I tend to think of it, is that online dating is a tool, and you can use a hammer for very productive purposes, and you can use a hammer for very destructive purposes, right? So I think there are approaches that you can take to online dating, but they do require you to kind of get out of the mindset of there is one perfect person for me. And the trick with online dating is to find the person who I have instant chemistry with and who is just the most amazing person, and that's the sign that I found the right person, right? Like, I tend to come from a mindset based on data and et cetera, that like relationships are something that you build, right? And so like finding somebody who is a good enough fit for your life, and I know that sounds so depressing, but I think that it's true, right? Like somebody who like has the kinds of qualities, who have the potential to grow a relationship with. I always say that someone who is reliable and someone who is warm, if you have someone with those traits, you can go very far on a lot of other dimensions. And then focus on the idea that like, it's not their job to be perfect, it's your job to co-build the relationship, right? So like, rather than trying to find the perfect person, try to be a good partner, and then you'll be able to use online dating to find someone who fits those criteria, and then get off the app, focus on that one person, and build some kind of connection with that person.
I feel like the number one complaint that I hear about like these dating apps is that it can desensitize the other person to, you know, finding their match. So even the problem that you were discussing about like trying to find the perfect person, It's kind of what it turns into for a lot of people, that people are just like swiping and, you know, it's your screen. So you have so many options, you keep looking, and then you end up with like having such a high standard to the point where you're just like, okay, nothing's good enough. And then it kind of turns into like either an attention game or like, you know, you're like desperately looking for that one person, but that one person maybe might not exist and maybe not on the app. So
there's always something better kind of mentality.
I think that's all true. I just think that the thing that like online dating gets, and I swear I'm not paid by any company for the record, but I think that the thing that online dating gets a bad rap about is that we have this conversation, we focus as if this trend is only happening with online dating. Everything else is not commodified and approached in a completely healthy way, right? Yeah. But of course that's not true, right? Like look at how we treat, I don't know, politics now and the kind of like way that we dehumanize people in the political sphere. Look at how, you know, we think that if we just go on Amazon or Temu or whatever the kids are using these days, right? And we'll just find that product that will make our life better. Like we commodify everything, right? Yeah. So if you really want to be serious about decommodifying your relationship life, you need to focus on more than just the apps. You need to make a broader cultural critique about why is it that we treat everything like disposable commodities.
Yeah, it's more of an internet problem than a internet dating problem.
I think it's a society problem. Yeah, and I'll stop my political critique at that point. Yeah.
Okay.
I think with a lot of these apps too, like people feel like they have to kind of signal in an evolutionary kind of psychology perspective. Like women have to like focus on their appearance, men have to kind of signal like wealth, and all that rich contextual stuff in terms of finding a partner gets kind of lost. You're kind of, and you have like a split second to make a decision. So in that sense, I can see people feeling like it's really frustrating because there's so much more to me than this. People aren't seeing it. And then you have people kind of feeling like they have to catfish in a sense to even get the swipe. Right.
One of the best, it makes me think, one of the best analyses that I've seen of, because don't get me wrong, I don't think that online dating is perfect. And I think the dynamic you're talking about is totally true. So it was a study, I forget the first author's name, but it was a student in Dan Ariely's lab. And what they talked about was that the type of online dating, like this app-based, picture-based, text-based kind of thing, is not particularly well suited to the actual task of choosing a partner. In the sense that, so they differentiate between what they call a choice good and an experience good, right? And so the idea is there are some things that you can buy online just fine. Like I've bought shoes online and like I know my shoe size, I know the style that I want. Typically I do that and the shoes that I want show up at my door and I like them, right? But there are other things that you can't advertise that way. So like back in the day, you would actually purchase music off of a place like Apple Music, right? And when you would be deciding which MP3 files to purchase, it wasn't just a text description. It wasn't like, oh, you know, this has a rumba beat at 98 beats per minute, et cetera, et cetera. You would pick that song and odds are it wouldn't be right for you, right? There's a reason why there was a clip of the song itself for you to experience before you actually made your decision, right? And one of the things that I think is true in relationship science is that, like, and this is where like the red pill bros, I think, are off the mark, right? Is that they kind of have this idea of there's a particular set of characteristics. Like you need to be this handsome and have this much money. And like that's what's going to, if you're the person highest in mate value, like then you will get people to like you, right? The research shows that more of romantic attraction is chemistry, like having that right fit with somebody, right? And that is what is missing from those apps is that ability to experience the person and find out if there actually is a right fit, which is kind of like the honest cue. So I do get why people are frustrated by it, and it is why, like in part of my sort of prescription for how to use online dating properly, go have a coffee with that person ASAP, like 1 or 2 messages, and then experience the person in person. Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're totally on the mark in that part. Yeah.
I guess like we talked about a lot about heterosexual relationships. Is there a lot of research on like same sex or other kind of relationships, or is it predominantly like in heterosexuals just because of the sample sizes and things like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can speak most directly to the research on singlehood. Yeah. So, most of the research so far has been heterosexual people. Just kind of always works like that. We've got a couple of things from our lab that we've been working on, trying to see what are queer people's experiences of singlehood. You know, how are they the same? How are they different? What we found so far is that queer singles They tend to be, and this has been found so many times in research on sexual minorities and well-being, is that queer singles tend to be lower in life satisfaction. They tend to be higher in loneliness than straight singles, but they at the same time seem to be happier about being single than straight singles, and they seem to be happier with their sex lives than singles. We're not 100% sure why that is at this point, but we've talked about things like there's often less expectation for traditional relationship forms in queer communities. And so one of the things that can make single people unhappy is getting all of this pressure, like, what's wrong with you? Why are you single, right? And if you live in a community where there's just less of those questions to be asked, then people don't have as much pressure to experience in that way. But yeah, no, so I mean, we really need more research on that. I mean, we wouldn't want to assume that queer people's experiences are the same. But there are, a couple of things that we've come across in the research that might be particular advantages for queer singles. So one of them, for example, is that queer single people, not that this is what queer people should have to do, but you can pass more easily when you're single than you're in a relationship. If you're a queer person walking down the street by yourself, there's less cues that you are queer for people to pick up on than you're walking down the street with your romantic partner, right? Yeah. Another group of queer people that we're interested in doing more work on is people who are questioning. And so we have some suggestion in our data that people who aren't sure of their sexuality really enjoy being single, because that is exactly the relationship structure that they need to be able to experiment, to be able to try things out, and to test out their feelings without worrying about, if I come to a particular answer about my sexuality, I might need to break up with my partner, right? So there are particular intersections of singlehood and queerness that I think are important directions to think about further. Yeah.
What role do attachment styles play in how people approach or avoid romantic relationships?
A big one. People's sense of comfort. I mean, really, when I think of attachment styles, it comes down to two main questions. Do you feel like you can trust other people? And do you feel confident that other people are going to like you? And so, like, the first one is what's fundamentally tied to avoidant attachment. The second one is what's fundamentally tied to anxious attachment. And those questions are really important for people's motivation to even get close to other people in the first place. So, I mean, I've literally taught entire courses on attachment, right? I do think it's really important, and it's actually been one of the pieces. It's easy, especially these days, to get pessimistic about society, right? But like the fact that attachment has gotten into the public consciousness as much as it has. I have issues with some of the ways, I think there's some ways that people talk about it, they're wrong. I think that people weaponize it sometimes. And so if you're mad at your partner, you can unfairly call them avoidant or whatever, right? Like there's ways that you can misuse this stuff. But on average, I think it's been a net gain because, when I've had so many students who've had this experience, and I had it myself, of like, you're doing stuff and you don't even know that you're doing it, right? And then when you read attachment, it's like, oh, here's the map. I still need to get myself out of this valley, but at least I know I'm in the valley.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just a question about, if you're a single person, what country or culture would maximize your happiness? Is there certain cultures where if you're single, you're more likely to be a happier person?
Yeah, so we do have some data that suggests that one of the big things that's going to be important here is the wealth or the income in your country. So my brilliant student, Elaine Hone, has a paper under review right now where we were able to get via the Gallup polling service data from like 160 countries, where we were able to compare the well-being of, in this case, it was married people versus unmarried people. Most of the work I do in my lab, I'm more interested in like, are you with a romantic partner or not? But when you're doing a survey in 160 countries, they more typically have like, are you married versus not married, like who you're dating. And what we found is that, because again, a lot of off the top of our discussion today, I was talking about how the data suggests that people in relationships are happier than people who are not in relationships. But almost all of that data is from Western countries, Western high-income countries. And so what Elaine found is that if you then also factor in everywhere else in the world, that these Western countries are unique, and it looks like they're unique because of GDP. That if you look in countries with lower GDP, it's actually, if anything, it's unmarried people who are happier than married people.
Really?
Yeah, and
Wouldn't have thought that.
yeah, we didn't think that either. And again, we don't know for sure, but it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. Of we do think that in order to have a happy relationship, you kind of need to have a good, solid material foundation. Like if you kind of can't afford to feed your family, then it's not going to be a very enjoyable experience to be married and to have a family, right? Yeah. So we think that there is an advantage in countries where wealth is not as abundant, where single people may be able to better navigate, at least when the outcome is their own individual well-being. Yeah.
Moving on to your career as a professor, how important is grant funding to a professor's research and career advancement?
Yeah, I mean, in general, it's very important, right? I mean, this is where we get the money to run our studies. And so, I mean, this is, one of the reasons why in the States right now, things are very uncertain, very anxious, is that the granting landscape is changing dramatically, I would say at the same time, though, it depends on how you work and it depends on what your goals are. So I hate writing grants, and I try to minimize it as part of my daily experience as much as possible. And I've been pretty fortunate. I mean, in Canada, up to this point, we've been very fortunate, especially in the social sciences. The Social Sciences and Humanities Council of Canada has funded basically all of the research that I've done. It is a huge resource in this country. We should be very grateful and very thankful for that and protect it strongly. And I've been able, you can get grants for 5 years. So I'm typically applying for a grant every 5 years, but it depends on the kind of research that you want to do. I mean, a lot of what we do is we give people surveys online, and it's not particularly expensive, right? I have colleagues who like to do research where they bring married couples into the lab, and now you're getting more in the way of expenses. I've got colleagues who do physiological research, and you need some very intense equipment, for example. It depends on the kind of work you want to do. So it's important for everybody, and it's something we all have to navigate. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I hate it, and I try to apply for grants as little as possible.
A lot of our audiences are interested in different career paths. Obviously, becoming a professor is one of them. Can you talk about, I guess, like in the Toronto area, what is the average salary if you're like an assistant, associate, full professor, the range for someone as a professor in psychology?
Yeah, I know, because I used to be the chair of the department, and I remember when we would make offers to new faculty, a starting research professor is going to be in the low six figures. I don't know the exact number. I mean, honestly, right, the correct answer to this is if you're in Ontario, it's all on the Sunshine List. So you can go
So you can
look it up for yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good answer.
Sounds good. How do you see the field of relationship science evolving in the next decade?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoy doing relationship research. I wonder if we have exhausted a lot of at the research level, a lot of the fundamental questions that we have. I think that like the basics of how to have a good relationship, like be responsive to each other, engage in good communication, that kind of thing. I mean, honestly, I feel like therapists have been way ahead of the researchers on this, right? And so I think that we researchers have just been documenting this. And so I think that in order for relationship research to really provide new value for the taxpayers who are paying for this work to be done, I think we're going to need to start expanding our focus a little bit, right? And so, it is also part of the reason why I've been interested in singlehood research is that here's this entire way of being that we don't know a lot about. People want to make good choices about whether this is right for them, and so we need more information about that, right? I also think that changes are coming in terms of, as we've talked about, like gender roles and social norms and that kind of thing. And so I think that we're going to need to do a better job. Psychologists in particular, we'd like to think that we're studying timeless phenomena, and things are changing so quickly. Like we need to be better aware of how much of what we're studying is like deeply rooted evolutionary processes, which I think are an important part of it. But we also need to be more mindful of just all of the different social changes that are happening. And so, I think we need to expand out from the question of like, how do people have a good relationship? I think we have a pretty good sense of that at the research level. I mean, this is what I always tell my students, right, is that it's not surprising what you need to do to be a good relationship partner. It's just hard to do. right? So I think that maybe that means that we also need to focus a little bit less on the basic research and a little bit more on helping people apply that in a healthy kind of way. So, I mean, honestly, the thing that I'd like to see is therapy made more easily available for people. I think that we have the map, and now we need guides to help people with the actual difficult emotional work of being able to do things like listen well, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and then finally, where can people learn more about your research? How can students, for example, get more information or even get involved?
Yeah, I think that the best place for people to go is we have a website, mcdonaldlab.ca. I have on there clips of media appearances. I assume if you're watching this clip is on there right now. So maybe you found it already. But yeah, we've also got all of our publications up on there. And so if you want to find in an academic way the kind of stuff that we've been doing, and we have links there to contact us if you're interested in getting more involved in the lab, you're interested in what studies we're doing, where to get involved in our studies. So yeah, mcdonaldlab.ca.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay.